When Botswana celebrated its independence from Britain in 1966, it was a poverty-stricken nation with not much going for it. Then, just 1 year later, diamonds were discovered. A lot of diamonds, paving the way for the country to become the world's largest producer of gem diamonds. Now this precious stone makes up 2/3 of the country's export earnings. The sound management of this industry has led to Botswana recording the highest average growth rate in the world for 30 years. Since then, economic growth slowed to just over 6%.
At independence, Botswana didn't really have physical and social infrastructure. We didn't have any tarred road, for instance. There were very, very few schools. So we invested large sums of money in improving the social and physical infrastructure.
Botswana is rated the least corrupt country in Africa by Transparency International and is one of the few countries to have escaped the resource curse. Government owns half of Botswana and has used these revenues to build up massive reserves and develop the country's infrastructure. It's also put an economic diversification plan in place to develop alternative sectors like tourism, manufacturing and agriculture. But this was working on a 30-year time frame. Now the country faces its biggest challenge yet, a 50% drop in diamond revenues.
The truth of the matter is, the Botswana diamond mines will not escape some adverse effect. So in the short term, a very challenging time. In the long term, however, the outlook is very good for the diamond industry. We have to conserve cash, because in the absence of robust sales, our cash flow position is constrained. And so some of the challenges we face are essentially how, in a period when we don't know with precision when the market will turn, how you preserve the cash that you have in hand. The other thing, of course, is that part of cash preservation is that you downsize. And certainly from a group perspective, we have had to look at our staff complement and undertake very painful reductions. With that comes the risk of losing talent, some of which we have ourselves invested in developing over the years. The balance between preserving cash by downsizing while at the same time retaining talent such that when the market turns around, you have the right people to capitalize on that market.
This view is shared by the diamond trading company Botswana. The DTC set up shop in country in March 2008. This is also a 50-50 partnership between the government of Botswana and De Beers, and is really the major vehicle for beneficiation in the diamond mining sector.
What happens is Botswana production comes to DTC Botswana. We value the goods. Those goods are then, once they're agreed, go to London, where they're mixed with productions from all over the world, and then goods are allocated to DTC Botswana, and they come back and we sell them locally.
When a diamond comes out of the ground, it doesn't really look like much at all. It's only once it's cut and polished that it really becomes something that every girl dreams about. And it's this cutting and polishing industry that's really become the focus of Botswana to add value to its diamond mining industry. But now, as the world goes into an economic slowdown, some say the survival of this young industry is at stake.
Of course, it's a very new industry and was just building up to full production. We had new factories opening through 2007, 2008. Timing of this crisis is very bad. The whole diamonds pipeline is pretty much seized up. But I think that that's going to be a temporary phenomenon. I would think by the middle of the year, diamonds should be flowing again. So it's a question of survival through short-term problems. Of course, that's very difficult for a new company which maybe won't have much cash. So I suspect many of the diamond companies will be turning to their bankers for short-term finance.
Safdeco is one of the 16 licensed cutting and polishing companies. It's a South African company that's just set up an entire diamond technology park, complete with zebra sanctuary.
The crisis we find ourselves in at the moment is a world liquidity crisis, which is basically influencing the diamond industry. So the number one challenge, as far as we are concerned in general, in diamond cutting today, is getting over this hurdle of this liquidity crisis.
The problem started with banks being unable to lend borrowers. And the diamond industry, especially the purchase of rough, is a cash upfront business. And so our clients through DTC Botswana are very vulnerable. And so through ourselves and the government and the industry itself, we are addressing the issue to find ways to mitigate and make sure that they survive this interim period.
So could government possibly intervene?
This industry is part and parcel of what we call a Diamond Hub, where we are promoting cutting, polishing, in jewelry, at the same time promoting trading, etc. So government has tried to provide certain incentives. Among those is the fact that all the companies that do qualify to cut and polish here, they are entitled to receive diamonds from DTC Botswana. That's one thing, which would not otherwise be guaranteed if they were operating elsewhere. Secondly, we have had to classify diamond cutting and polishing as manufacturing, and therefore attracting a much lower tax. On the question of financing, we believe that our banking system are looking at the best way of funding the working capital for these companies. We have been promoting the establishment of a special financing facility for diamonds. This facility will be guaranteed by OPIC of the United States. We think that will make a contribution. The initial amount which is contemplated is $250 million US.
The key to getting through this difficult time seems to be knowing exactly what will sell. But the consensus seems to be that things will turn around. It's just a question of when.
Within the cutting industry within Botswana, they are struggling at the moment. We've had one closure. Again, but we're there to help them. We're not putting pressure on them at all. We're helping them, trying to supply them with exactly what they want to keep them sustainable through this period.
The two major principles we have to take into account to keep diamond cutting going as a viable option in these current very difficult economic times are the fact that the two things being, number one, only to purchase and manufacture diamonds where you can see profit. And number two, it's not enough to see profit, it's got to be diamonds that can be sold to the downstream market. Southern Africa obviously comes with very specific challenges that one doesn't see in more western cutting centres such as Antwerp and New York, and most definitely not in the more eastern cutting centres such as India and China, which are up-and-coming centres. It's very important to know and to have a defined strategy how to do business in Africa.
Botswana sits on the cusp of a new dawn, one where the future seems uncertain, but the tools it's got are, to say the least, pretty useful. Government's going to tap into its $9.2 billion reserves, which is about 28 months of imports, and for the first time in almost 20 years is looking to organizations like the World Bank for loans.
This year we are going to allow a substantial deficit. This is part and parcel of our strategy to stimulate the economy. It's part of the stimulus which takes into account the international financial and economic crisis. We will be borrowing from international institutions. The World Bank may be one source, but we will not be borrowing from IMF because IMF assists countries which have got a balance of payments problem. We don't have a balance of payments problem. We don't expect to have that.
In addition, the country doesn't plan to slow down on its infrastructure spending.
We expect growth to continue in the non-mining sectors. That includes construction, that includes trade, that includes industry. We don't see any reason why those should not, and they will be promoting them. Part of the growth, of course, will come from government expenditure. As you know, we're having a substantial development budget of more than 10 billion pula. Most of that money will be used in promoting projects.
Tannery Industries Botswana is one company that's taken the bull by the horns on this opportunity and has seen a steady increase in sales as a result.
TIB was set up to take advantage of the raw material available in Botswana as a function of the large beef industry, with the idea of converting that raw material into finished leather for the regional market. This was an exercise that was taken about by two entrepreneurs, local entrepreneurs together with what is known here as the Cedar Venture Capital Fund to establish the business.
The company exports its skins to South African manufacturers.
These end up becoming shoes, couches, furniture couches. A lot of the material you see even with the hair on go into ottomans, for instance. We are starting to look at other opportunities as well, i.e. the automotive industry. So those are the three predominant areas of where our product ends up in.
Despite the country's small population of just under 2 million, labour seems to be one of the attractions of operating in Botswana.
Labour is available, and again I must stress it's well qualified labour which needs to be trained, but it means that it's easier to train because most people here have been to school. We don't have a very unionized workforce in this country, which some people might say is good, some people might say it's bad, but I think from our side it makes it easier to, the workforce then is less militant, I would say, which makes it easier, of course, to establish good labor relationships with your staff.
Botswana's manufacturing sector has been highlighted as one of the areas that will be least affected by the global crisis.
All sectors will suffer, but I think probably manufacturing less than most, because much manufacturing is based on less cyclical industries like food processing and clothing and textiles. I mean, everything's negatively affected, as I say, but those sort of core consumer goods are not being affected nearly as much as mining and construction and capital equipment and automobiles. So I think that the Botswana manufacturing sector will, in relative terms, probably get away more lightly than other sectors.
The country's textile industry has also benefited from the AGOA trade agreements.
One of the sectors that we have put a lot of concentration is our manufacturing sector. With particular attention, we're looking at taking advantage of the various agreements that we've got with other countries. For instance, if you look at AGOA, which is the African Growth Opportunity Act of the US, where they are looking at giving special attention to goods that are coming out of Africa to enter the US market, and I think they've got about 6,500 product lines. We have largely managed to penetrate that through textiles and so forth, and that has been a success. And I think currently we are looking at about, I stand under correction, but we're looking at a double digit in terms of percentage of our manufacturing sector.
Just 20 minutes outside Gaborone is a small town called Ramotswa. And when it's the rainy season, it tends to get a little flooded. And it's to this small town, virtually in the middle of nowhere, that Chin Shi Huang comes all the way from Melbourne, Australia every holiday. She comes here to help her dad in his textile factory called Fascinating Botswana.
1997年，政府一个援外的项目，带了一帮日人过来开了一个厂。开了厂以后呢，因为当时在这当厂长，觉得这里的政策比较好，所以呢，我们觉得自己开还是比较好。有个适当的机会的话呢，我们就自己开。99年，基本上我们自己都申请了一个营业执照。2001年我们就正式开始投产了现在的 Fascinating Botswana。
He said he came in Botswana in 1999 and he's working for a Taiwanese company, and that Taiwanese company has employed him as a factory manager. And because of the manager, and he knows the policy of the Botswana, and he knows there's a policy called FAP, and he decided to open a new company by himself. So he started 1999 operating his own company, and it's called Fascinating Botswana, and started in 2001 we started operating. Because of the Botswana FAP policy, we have got a lot of assistance from the Botswana government, and they have provided with us the training fees and also the machine fees and etc.
Initially, Fascinating Botswana supplied goods to Europe and the US, but now only supplies to major South African retail chains.
卖给了 Woolworths, Adidas, Foschini, 跟 XZ.
Safety is a major plus point for Botswana as its neighbour South Africa struggles with high crime rates. But there are other reasons why Botswana is an attractive investment destination.
Safety and security, political stability, very secure investments. Botswana might be landlocked, but you should be looking at Botswana as a gateway into broader Africa. We have linkages with at least 4 countries. I'm sure you know Namibia, South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and so forth. So we are really right there smack in the middle. And we really, in the literal sense, are a gateway into broader Africa.
Botswana plans to make itself a regional gateway in its financial services sector. 10 years ago, exchange controls were removed and investors were invited into the country with attractive incentives like a 15% corporate tax rate.
Broadly speaking, Botswana financial sector comprises of 7 commercial banks and 1 merchant bank. Going back at the history of banking, we had Barclays and Standard Chartered Bank that were the pioneers of banking in Botswana. They were set up in the early 1950s, which was then followed in the 1980s by Bank of Credit and Commerce. Subsequent to that, we've seen a number of players coming into the market. We saw Capital Bank that came into the market last year, but prior to that we saw Bank of Baroda, Capital Bank, Bank Habaroni, and Stanbic as well over the number of years.
And it seems as though there's still room for more players.
I think there's probably still scope for more banks, maybe certain more specialised banks. But I think in general it's quite competitive, and banks are quite aggressive in competing for market share. They're not particularly aggressive on competing in terms of fees and costs. I think that's one area where there's a problem. I think the cost of banking is fairly high, and certainly the banks are extremely profitable, so there's scope for competition to bring the cost of banking down. But in terms of product and service innovation, I think it's quite strong.
The Botswana Stock Exchange is over 20 years old. It's comprised of 2 indexes, and it's no surprise that it's the foreign companies index, particularly the commodity-based stocks, that have plummeted. But despite that, the bourse has recorded a record turnover in 2008.
The best year up to date for the BSC has been 2008. In spite of the crisis that took place towards the last quarter. If you take, for example, the turnover of the BSC, which could give you some idea of liquidity, how the liquidity has increased in the BSC. In 2006, our average turnover was something like 1.7 million pula per day. In 2007, it increased to about 3.4 million pula per day. And last year, we hit about 4.8 million pula per day. If you take the performance of the index, we have been hit, especially about middle of October, like I think every stock exchange in the world has been hit, but not to the extent that some other stock exchanges have got impacted. For example, our domestic company index, and the domestic company index, I must say, is the measure for the Botswana Stock Exchange, because we list foreign stocks. And up to 31st of December, we used to calculate the domestic company index, we used to calculate a foreign company index, and then an all company index. And the all company index was very biased towards the foreign companies because of their huge size in terms of market capitalization, and our indices are market capitalization weighted. If you take the domestic company index, we lost about 16.5% last year, which I think is good compared to what some of the other markets have lost.
Currently, the stocks that have suspended operation and suspension on the stock exchange pending publication of some announcement. I am aware that African Copper is currently suspended its operations because of some capital liquidity. There's also Diamondex, which has also suspended its operation in the Lerala, and it's actually put the workers on forced leave.
While 2009 looks to be a shaky year, there is still talk in the industry of the possible listing of a local retailer, Choppies.
We've got an indigenous chain store here called Choppies Supermarket, which has been rumored that is coming onto the market. So at least as of now, that's the only thing that we've heard, that Choppies Superstores will be coming onto the market.
And despite the global financial situation, plans to launch a commodity and derivatives exchange this year are still going ahead. This venture is expected to attract an initial capital investment of $75 million and plans to create subsidiaries in Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya and Zambia.
The Indian partners, Financial Technologies of India, through their multi-commodity exchange, are still confident and going ahead with the implementation of this project in 2009. They are taking a long-term view that despite a bullish nature of African commodities at the moment, it's still one of their headline objectives was to improve price discovery and partner or set up subsidiary exchanges in certain key African countries, and they have a long-term business plan, and they still want to continue with that, so that's still ongoing.
Botswana realized that it was short-sighted to focus solely on its diamond industry as a source of revenue. So it started a diversification plan, targeting areas like beef and manufacturing, and of course, tourism.
We have been successful particularly in two areas and heavily reliant on those two areas, which is mining and beef, particularly beef with regards to the exports to the overseas markets and the mining of the diamonds, the copper, and so forth. And government felt that it was necessary to try and reduce the over-reliance on these two product lines.
Botswana has benefited from trade agreements like AGOA and Cotonou, and now produces duty-free and quota-free beef for the European Union. In total, agriculture contributes 2.8% to the country's GDP, and around 80% of this is through beef exports.
We have never really, even at the times when we had the quota, we've never been able to meet that quota system. But we have managed our resources so well that we have, despite the challenges that we've got in Africa, such as the various foot and mouth diseases, etc., we have managed to basically sail through that one because of the systems that we've put in place to ensure that we meet all the specific criteria that have been set by the EU, which are very, very high. So yes, I would say it is a steady increase, but we haven't really met the expectations of that market in terms of the volumes that we take forward. And hence the linkage of our strategy of saying, look, what is it that we need to do further within the beef industry so that we can increase our production, so that we can not only meet but surpass the expectations of that market and even possibly go into other markets. And our study revealed that there's a lot that we can do. You know that in terms of the beef production in Botswana, it's largely based on our traditional methods of farming. But I'm sure there is other systems that have been revealed by the studies, such as improving our feeder system, perhaps coming up with production of our own feeds, and looking at the whole spectrum of that industry to be able to not only increase the production, to increase the numbers, to better the product at the end of the day so that we can continue to compete better.
When most people think of tourism in Botswana, majestic open plains and wildlife come to mind. And most tourists would simply bypass the country's capital to go up north to destinations like Maun and the Salt Pans. Now, thanks to Precious Ramotswe and her #1 ladies detective agency, tourists are flying to Gaborone to see the sites that feature in this popular book series. The books, written by Alexander McCall Smith, are now hitting the small screen in the form of a once-off film broadcast and now a TV series. Africa Insight is a family-run company specializing in tours in and around Gaborone, and they've got the rights to the #1 ladies detective agency tour.
Before 5 or 6 years ago, nobody came to Gaborone as a destination in itself. In fact, if you read some of the guidebooks, you'll find it's not even mentioned. Some guidebooks to Botswana simply don't go further south than the Okavango Delta. And so it's actually quite hard work making Gaborone a destination in itself. But we were very lucky because of the profile of the books and the interest that they generated. We had a lot of press interest initially, and it got very quickly onto the map. We were actually invited by the author, Alexander McCall Smith, to do the tours based on his books. We were wandering around with him and a film crew a few years ago, and one of the people which we were interviewing for that film said, hey, someone should do a tour based on these books. So he turned around to me and said, well, you do tourism, why don't you do one?
From housewives in the US to business people in Europe, Ma Ramotswe seems to strike a chord in just about everyone. So what makes her so special?
It's probably because she's a little bit idealized. She represents a type of person that people like to imagine. She's also very real, and you find a lot of people around the city, around the country, who could be Precious Ramotswe.
But what most people don't realize is that the Gaborone of the first few books is a lot different from the one we see today.
One of the things that people comment on, probably one of the first things they comment on, is the fact that the city they don't find it as they expected, and they don't realize the pace of development. So although the first book was written in 1996, which is 13 years ago, there's been such a huge change in the city since then. We drive around and they expect to see a tiny little provincial town almost, and it's actually a fairly developed modern city now.
Botswana may be getting a whole lot bigger, busier and faster, but anyone here will tell you that sometimes taking it slow is not only more rewarding, but an essential part to doing business in Botswana. And as Ma Ramotswe might say, so is having a cup of red bush tea.